Katie Rodriguez had been a nurse at Seattle General in Denver for exactly 3 months when Dr. Mercer began his campaign. He didn't know she was watching him. He didn't know her meticulous charting had already caught the phantom procedures, 14 coded on Medicare patients in 6 weeks, procedures that never happened, signatures forged in blue ink that didn't match his actual handwriting under fluorescent light. She documented exactly what she saw. Nothing more. Nothing less. That was the problem. The antiseptic smell of the third-floor corridor mixed with old coffee as Katie moved through morning shift, her hand steady as she updated the medication log for room 312. 72-year-old Korean War veteran, pneumonia, stable vitals. She'd written the entries in perfect block letters, each medication cross-referenced against what the supply company actually delivered versus what Dr. Mercer had ordered. The discrepancy was clean. Methodical. A medical supply company billing for 40 units for antibiotics but delivering 20. Kickback arrangement, the kind that made her jaw clench the same way it had in Kandahar when she'd watched corruption get soldiers killed. But that was a lifetime ago. That was before the orders came down. Before her records were scrubbed. Before Captain Katie Rodriguez became just Katie, a civilian nurse who kept her head down and documented everything she saw. She pulled a faded unit patch from the lost and found drawer, 75th Ranger Regiment, the fabric worn soft with age and sweat. Someone had left it here last week, tucked behind a coat. She'd been planning to post it on the bulletin board. The patch felt familiar in her hands, like muscle memory made physical. Her fingers traced the stitching. 3 tours. For years. A lifetime compressed into a 6x4-inch piece of cloth. She tucked it back into the drawer, beneath the scarves and forgotten reading glasses. Not yet. Not safe yet. Her phone buzzed. Her son again. Marcus, 14, texting from school, "Mom, when you home?" Hungry. She typed back, 6 p.m. Leftovers in fridge. He didn't respond. He never did anymore. Not since the move to Denver. Not since she'd had to leave Seattle and take a job under a name that felt borrowed, at a hospital where nobody knew her history, nobody asked questions, nobody saw the surgical scars that twisted like rope burns down her forearms when she reached for 4 bags during night shift. The scars told stories. She was careful to keep her sleeves down. The double doors of Seattle General swung open at 0700 hours sharp. Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds the way he arrived every day, white coat crisp, cologne expensive, smile not quite reaching his eyes. He was 48, had inherited money, had a brother-in-law who sat on the hospital board. That was his power. That was what made him untouchable. He moved through the 3rd floor like he owned it, pausing at each patient's bedside for exactly 90 seconds, asking perfunctory questions, already moving to the next room before the patient could answer. Katie stood at the nurse's station, charting notes on the board. She felt his presence before she saw him, that particular weight of attention that comes from someone used to being feared. His eye swept across the patient documentation, across the medication logs, across her hands as she wrote. She didn't look up. She never did. Professional. Competent. Invisible. Rodriguez. His voice carried the particular weight of someone who'd never been told no. Room 312. The pneumonia case. Yes, doctor. She kept her pen moving, steady hand, steady breath. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He stepped closer to the board. You're charting here. The medication quantities. Exactly what was delivered and administered, doctor. He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes lingered on her forearms for a fraction too long, the moment when the edge of a surgical scar peeked out from beneath her sleeve cuff. She didn't pull the sleeve down. Didn't flinch. Didn't react. She simply returned to her charting, pen moving across the page with the kind of precision that required actual training. Military training. The kind that taught you to move with purpose, to document under pressure, to know the difference between what was ordered and what was delivered when lives depended on accuracy. "These numbers seem excessive," Dr. Mercer said. "The supply company wouldn't bill for deliveries that large." Katie turned one page of the chart. Spoke without looking at him. "I logged each item received. Cross-referenced against the invoice manifest. The numbers are accurate, Doctor." Something flashed across his face. Irritation. The subtle recognition that he'd been caught. But it passed quickly, replaced by that practiced smile. He moved on to the next patient, white coat trailing behind him like a flag. But something had changed. Katie felt it the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. The attention had been switched on. And it wouldn't switch off. She finished her charting and moved to the medication room, a small space with white walls and steel cabinets that locked at midnight. The hiss of the door closing behind her sounded like relief. She pulled down her sleeve, looked at the scars that ran from wrist to elbow, shrapnel wounds from a roadside IED in Kandahar, 2016, the kind of injuries that should have ended a career. They had ended a career. Just not the way anyone outside of JSOC knew about it. The official story was that Captain Katie Rodriguez had been honorably discharged for a back injury. The real story was that she'd been part of a classified operation that went sideways, and the Army had decided that the cleanest solution was to erase her. New identity. New SSN. New life. New name. She pulled her sleeve back down. Checked the supply log. Verified the medication counts. Everything aligned. Everything was correct. That was her strength and her weakness. She couldn't ignore discrepancies. Couldn't look the other way. Couldn't pretend that phantom procedures and kickback arrangements didn't matter just because she was invisible and he was powerful. The intercom crackled, Dr. Mercer to room 318. Code Blue protocol initiated. The alert sounded routine, practiced. She knew that code. Everyone did. She moved toward the elevator without thinking, without hesitation, because that was what nurses did. That was what Captain Rodriguez did. You moved toward the crisis, you acted, you saved lives, you didn't think about the consequences. Room 318 was chaos in motion. A 76-year-old man, cardiac history, monitor showing irregular rhythm. The resident was pale, frozen, hands not moving. Dr. Mercer stood at the bedside, already reaching for the crash cart with the kind of lazy confidence that came from never doubting himself. Katie slipped into the room and assessed in 2 seconds flat. Heart rate dropping. Blood pressure falling. The resident was incompetent. Dr. Mercer was going through motions. The patient was in genuine distress. She moved to the crash cart. 12 lead EKG. Now. The resident scrambled. She was already reaching for the monitor leads, already positioning them with the kind of precision that required actual training. Her hands moved on their own. The muscle memory from Kandahar, from field operations, from the kind of medical training that happened in combat hospitals where you learned to work fast because people died when you were slow. The monitor showed the reading. Atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular response. The man's oxygen sat dropping. She glanced at Dr. Mercer. He was looking at her with something new in his eyes. Not just irritation now. Recognition. The kind of look that comes when you see something you weren't supposed to see. "Looks like you know what you're doing," he said. Not a compliment. An observation. The moment lasted 2 seconds. Then the patient stabilized. The resident called cardiology. The crisis paused. And Dr. Mercer left the room, white coat trailing, that smile not reaching his eyes. Katie finished the documentation. Precise. Accurate. Everything charted exactly as it happened. That was her commitment. That was her curse. She couldn't look away from the truth, couldn't pretend things were other than what they were, couldn't perform the comfortable blindness that made hospital politics work smoothly for people like Dr. Mercer. She returned to the 3rd floor at 0845. The morning rounds continued. Dr. Mercer moved through patients with practiced efficiency, but something had shifted in the way he looked at her. Not quite suspicion yet. Something closer to awareness. She existed now. She was visible. And that was dangerous. By 1100, the first sign appeared. A patient in room 314, diabetic, stable, routine care. Dr. Mercer had ordered an 4 placement. Katie had performed it. Perfect insertion. 18 gauge. Textbook technique. She documented it with precision, full line placed at 1045 hours. 18 gauge angiocath. Insertion site clean. Patent flow. Patient tolerating procedure without complication. When Dr. Mercer arrived for afternoon check, he looked at the 4 with intensity. Then he looked at the documentation. Then he looked at Katie, who stood across the room, not making eye contact, hands visible, posture professional. The standard posture of a woman who knew how to be invisible. This placement, he said to the patient, voice loud enough to carry into the hallway. I'm concerned about the angle. It's irregular. The patient looked uncomfortable. It doesn't hurt. That doesn't mean it's correct. Dr. Mercer looked directly at Katie now. This is the kind of mistake that gets people hurt. Slow infusions. Infiltration. A nurse who doesn't know what she's doing can damage a vein. Katie's jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter. Her breathing stayed steady. Her hands didn't shake. The calm that comes from having already survived worse. The placement is per protocol, doctor, she said. 10 words exactly. Professional. Level. The voice of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Protocol. He said it like a curse word. He turned to face her fully. The veteran's family in the adjacent bed went quiet. The hallway noise seemed to pause. Protocol means nothing if the execution is sloppy. And this, he gestured at the 4, is sloppy. This is what happens when we hire nurses without proper credentials. The words landed like ordnance. Incompetent. Sloppy. Without proper credentials. She felt the family's eyes shift toward her. Felt the judgment settle in. Mercer turned and left, white coat trailing, already moving to the next patient, already dismissing her as beneath his notice. But the damage was done. The seed was planted. She was no longer invisible. She was a target. She finished her charting at the nurse's station, hand steady, pen precise. Each note documented exactly what had occurred. Each medication logged. Each vital sign recorded. This was her weapon. This was all she had, the meticulous documentation of truth. At 1300, the break room filled with the usual suspects. Jenkins from night shift, picking through the refrigerator. Torres and Chen from her own unit, gathering their lunch containers. Katie sat at the far end of the table with her turkey sandwich and black coffee, not speaking, not making eye contact, the way she'd learned to be invisible in rooms full of people who didn't need to see her. She watched the moment shift. Jenkins pulled his plate out. Torres and Chen exchanged a glance, brief, loaded, the kind that happens when information has been shared. When judgments have been made. They gathered their containers. They stood. They left without a word, their silence louder than any accusation. The door swung closed behind them. She was alone in the break room with her sandwich, with the fluorescent lights humming overhead, with the weight of having been seen and found wanting. She ate anyway. Methodical. Professional. The kind of composed response that was her only armor against men like Mercer who couldn't tolerate what they didn't understand. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 6:24 a.m., posted directly under the staff schedule where every nurse on shift would see it during rounds. Katie stood in front of it with her coffee still steaming in her hand, her eyes moving across the fabricated lines, protocol violations, Nurse K. Rodriguez, persistent failures in documentation standards, medication timing errors, patient safety concerns under review. 15 colleagues circulated through that hallway in the next 90 seconds. 15 people read those words. 15 people watched her read them. She didn't flinch. She didn't crumple the paper or demand to know who authorized it. She simply turned and continued her shift, her jaw clenched just tight enough that someone standing close would have noticed the muscle working at the corner of her face. But no one was standing close. They never did anymore. By that afternoon, Dr. Mercer had made his first phone call to the Washington State Department of Health. Katie didn't know about it yet, not the call itself, not the careful wording about concerns regarding credential verification, not the insinuation that her nursing license might require additional scrutiny. She only knew that something had shifted in the weight of the air around her, the way it does before thunder that's still 10 miles away. The Week 10 brutality had started quietly. A dying veteran in Trauma 3 whose family had gathered like they were preparing for war. The machines around him hissed and clicked in their mechanical chorus, and Katie was running the full line when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, his presence like a storm front moving across the room. "Nurse Rodriguez," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular edge designed for maximum audience, "your foreplacement is amateur at best. Did you even attend an accredited nursing school?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. 3 family members turned to stare. Katie felt their eyes on her neck, her hands, her face. She took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake, she wouldn't allow them to, but a single tear escaped from her left eye and traveled down her cheek in that fraction of a second where everything hangs suspended. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Mercer. "I document exactly what I see, Doctor, nothing more, nothing less." The family shifted uncomfortably. One of the daughters looked at her father's monitor instead of at either of them. 2 days later in the break room, Katie was opening her lunch container when the veteran nurses arrived. 4 of them, Margaret with 23 years of service, Diane who'd trained in Chicago, Sarah who moved with a kind of efficiency that came from 40-year-old muscle memory, and Jen, the youngest of them at 41. Katie watched them gather their trays. She saw Margaret's eyes flick toward her, then away. Saw Sarah make a small gesture with her hand. The group shifted as one organism, wheels on the linoleum floor squeaking like a warning, and they moved to the far table by the window. The silence that followed was louder than conversation. One whisper carried back, "Med school's pet project," and Katie recognized the voice as belonging to someone she'd helped through a difficult night shift 3 weeks prior. The nickname spread through the unit like a contagion, mutating slightly with each telling. By the end of the week it was a Med's mistake, then the mistake, then just a specific kind of look when she entered a room. Week 9 was when Mercer intensified. He began calling his contact at the state licensing board again, this time with more ammunition. "I'm increasingly concerned," Katie heard him tell someone over his office phone. She was passing with patient charts and his door was open enough to catch fragments. "The discrepancies I'm seeing in her clinical practice, I worry it's not just incompetence. I worry about liability. Seattle General's liability." The way he framed it was brilliant, Katie realized with the kind of cold clarity that came from understanding exactly how institutional systems could be weaponized. He wasn't accusing her of anything specific. He was suggesting that the hospital itself was at risk. That was enough. By week 10, the reassignments began. Katie's scheduled nursing partners started vanishing. She was assigned to work with Marcus on Monday. Her shift began and Marcus called in sick at 6:15 a.m., and by 6:45 a.m. memo appeared assigning her to work with Johnson, a nurse from another floor who didn't know her rhythms, didn't know her patients, didn't know anything except that she'd been explicitly transferred to work alongside Katie Rodriguez. Thursday she was scheduled with Patricia, but Patricia suddenly had a medical appointment that couldn't be moved, and Katie's shift became solo coverage with float support, which meant she'd be working without a consistent partner, which meant she'd be more visible during every mistake, more exposed during every crisis, more isolated during every moment that mattered. The night shift was worst. That's when Mercer moved her. Day shift had witnesses, had structure, had the buffer of departmental oversight. Night shift had shadows. Night shift had skeleton crews and hallways that echoed and the kind of exhaustion that made even careful people make errors. Katie's new rotation was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Friday through Monday, which meant she'd be covering the pediatric wing when most of the administrative staff was sleeping. It meant she'd be working alongside nurses she didn't know. It meant she'd be alone in a way that mattered. She drove home after her first night shift at 7:34 a.m. with the sun rising over Denver in shades of orange and purple, and something in her chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. This was what Mercer wanted. This was the campaign, the real campaign, not the insults or the public humiliation but the systematic isolation. He was building a case. Every shift alone was documentation. Every float nurse who reported that she seemed distracted was a potential witness. Every solo decision she made on night shift without backup could be reframed as recklessness. The rain started that evening, soft at first, then harder, drumming against her apartment window like a code she couldn't quite decode. Katie sat at her kitchen table with her uniform still damp and pulled out every single chart she'd worked on in the last 3 months. She checked the dates, the times, the medication doses, the vital sign documentation. Everything was perfect. Everything was meticulous. Everything was exactly as she'd written it, which meant nothing in a system designed to question everything she touched. She was still there at midnight, her handwriting blurring together, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Call in sick tomorrow." Trust me. No signature. No explanation. Katie stared at it for 47 seconds, then deleted it. She didn't sleep. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer didn't know what he'd actually found in her records. He didn't know about the supply company discrepancies, not really, he only knew that Katie had noticed something, documented something, represented some kind of threat to the kickback arrangement that was running through his office like a parallel circulatory system. And because he didn't know what she knew, he was trying to destroy her with everything he had, throwing institutional weight at her like a boxer throwing wild punches at something moving in the shadows. Wednesday of week 10, Katie received notification from the state licensing board. A routine inquiry regarding credential verification. Routine. The word sat in her stomach like a stone. They wanted documentation of her initial nursing certification, her prior employment history, her training background. All of it. The things that had been carefully constructed, legally registered, but which led back to places that didn't exist anymore, to operations classified so far above normal channels that even the state board wouldn't have security clearance to understand what they were looking at if she tried to explain. She had no previous employer to reference. No training institution that would match civilian records. No history before she became Katie Rodriguez, RN, because Captain Rodriguez from the 75th Army Ranger Regiment didn't officially exist in any documentation that mattered. She understood now, with the kind of clarity that came only from having already survived the worst, Mercer was going to bury her in bureaucracy while simultaneously isolating her on a night shift where nothing she did was witnessed by anyone who mattered. By the time the Pentagon called, if the Pentagon ever called, her career would already be ash. The ambulance bay doors crashed open at 03 for 7 hours, and the night shattered into controlled chaos. The paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the entrance with the practiced urgency of a crew that had seen too much, a John Doe from a single vehicle collision, unconscious, no wallet, no identification, his clothes torn and matted with blood that looked black under the fluorescent lights. Katie was already moving, her feet silent on the tile despite the noise around her, her mind already calculating, already sorting through the variables that meant life or death in the next 60 minutes. "Trauma Bay 2, she said, not asked. The attending resident hesitated for exactly 1 second. She was supposed to defer to him, supposed to follow protocol, but something in the way she'd spoken made him nod and step aside. The stretcher wheel squeaked as they rolled, as loud as screams in the pre-dawn silence. Paramedic Torres was calling out vitals, male, approximate age 45, GCS of 5, no response to pain, blood pressure 88/52 and dropping, respiratory rate 28, oxygen sat 84% on high-flow non-rebreather. The trauma team assembled like a choreograph machine. Respiratory therapy. Surgery. Imaging tech with the portable ultrasound already warming up. And Katie, moving to the head of the bed with a pair of trauma shears, beginning the careful, methodical work of exposing the patient's injuries. Clothes had to come off. Fast. Everything had to be visible. The resident was calling for an for setup, for type and cross, for the trauma protocol, and Katie was cutting through the man's jacket, the leather stiff with blood, when her fingers caught on something unusual. A patch sewn into the lining. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge it. The shears continued their work, and her eyes flickered down for just 1 second, enough to see the faded Ranger tab, enough to recognize the scroll and the tab, enough to know exactly what regiment this man had served in. 75th Ranger Regiment. The same unit she'd worked with in Kandahar 3 years ago. The same unit she wasn't supposed to remember. Pain is data. The thought came automatic, military-wired into her nervous system. She filed the information away and focused on what she could see: massive contusions to the left chest, bruising that spread from collarbone to hip bone like a roadmap of trauma. His breath sounds on the left side were absent. Dead air. She could see his neck veins distending, could see the way his skin was taking on that grey cast that came only from massive physiologic stress. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing the heart, blocking return of blood to his chambers, killing him with every heartbeat. She moved to the medication cart, selected a 14-gauge angiocath needle, and returned to the patient's side. The resident was still ordering labs, still working from the protocol checklist, still following the sequence that hospital policy demanded. Katie approached the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the classic location, the textbook location, the one they taught him in medical school. But her hands moved on instinct, on memory, guided by something deeper than training. Her fingers found the angle, the precise plane where the needle would travel between the ribs with minimum trauma, where the air would escape with a sound like relief itself. She didn't ask permission. Didn't announce the procedure. She just did it. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like a held breath finally released. Immediate. The patient's oxygen sat jumped from 78 to 82. His blood pressure began to climb. 90/54. 94/56. The grey began leaving his skin. A second needle for balance, and the physiology corrected itself, the lung re-expanded, the heart could pump again, the body accepted the gift of continued existence. A voice from the doorway, quiet but cutting through the noise like a blade. That's a bagram insertion angle. Where does civilian nurse learn that? Katie didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge the retired combat medic who'd been observing from the hallway, who'd seen something in her technique that didn't fit. She simply continued working, her movements precise, efficient, economical in the way of someone who'd performed these procedures in dusty medical tents while mortars fell outside. The medical crisis continued, the patient needed imaging, needed surgery, needed the full trauma team's attention, and she faded back into her role, into the careful invisibility that had kept her alive for 3 months. But the medic was still watching. She could feel it. By the time they wheeled the patient to CT, Katie had already inventoried the belongings they'd cut away. The jacket. The torn jeans. A pair of boots, military issue, broken in with the kind of wear that came from thousands of miles of humping rucksacks through hostile terrain. She held the boots, her thumbs running across the leather, and felt the ridge of something hard. Something sewn into the interior lining of the heel. She worked the object free. A Ranger tab. A combat badge. The kind you didn't earn, the kind you were issued after you'd passed selection, after you'd proven you belonged in the regiment. And sewn into the tag was a name. Captain James Chen. Kandahar. Joint operations. 3 years ago. She'd treated him for shrapnel wounds during a mission she wasn't supposed to remember, in a location she wasn't supposed to know, under orders she couldn't violate even if it meant watching him die. The badge felt like weight in her palm. Like treason. Like the past breaking through the careful walls she'd constructed between who she was and who she was pretending to be. Katie set the badge back into the boot and placed both in the secure storage locker, her fingers lingering for one moment on the leather before she closed the door. The clock on the wall read 0418 hours. The patient was in CT now, would be in surgery within the hour, his condition stable enough for the next phase of trauma protocol. She should go back to the break room. Should sit in the corner and drink terrible coffee and avoid eye contact with the nurses who'd learned not to speak to her. Instead, she walked to the patient care station and began reading his scans as they uploaded. The CT tech was calling out findings: massive hemothorax, bleeding from multiple rib fractures, a lacerated spleen that would need removal, evidence of head trauma that made every second count. This man had minutes remaining before his physiology would begin the cascade of failure that nothing could reverse. The civilian medical system would give him antibiotics, would give him transfusions, would give him surgery. But what he needed, what he might need, was information only the army had. Previous injuries. Pre-existing conditions. Medications that might interact with the drugs they were about to pump into his veins. Protocol was clear. No contact with outside agencies without attending physician approval. Dr. Mercer was the attending. Dr. Mercer, who'd been strategically calling her competence into question, who'd already begun documenting her chart entries as questionable clinical judgment, who'd submitted a formal request to the state licensing board at 0600 hours that morning to verify her employment credentials, claiming he'd found discrepancies in her application materials. The request had landed in her inbox as a courtesy that felt more like a threat. The state would investigate. It would take 3 weeks, maybe 4, and by that time he would have isolated her completely, would have ensured that no one on the day shift worked with her, that no one could vouch for her clinical skills. By 0800 hours, both of her scheduled nursing assistants had been reassigned without explanation. By 1000, her name had been removed from the day shift rotation and permanently moved to nights. She was being erased, slowly and methodically, using the very systems designed to protect patients as a weapon against someone who'd tried to protect one. The patient, Captain James Chen, though no one knew that yet, though his name was still listed as John Doe in the chart, was being wheeled to the operating room at 1054 hours. Katie watched him go, her jaw tight, her hand steady, her mind already moving through the consequences of what she was about to do. She had a 15-minute window. Mercer was in the operating suite. The resident was in the supply room. The floor was brief seconds of relative solitude. She walked to the supply closet and closed the door behind her, the darkness sudden and complete. Her phone came out. The casualty assistance line she'd memorized from a briefing she wasn't supposed to remember. The words came quiet, clipped, the accent and cadence she'd trained out of her voice for 3 months slipping back in like muscle memory. 75th Regiment. Ranger Tab, serial number November 74526 Charlie 9. Name, Chen, James. Unit, Kandahar Joint Operations. Status, critical trauma, Army surgical candidate. She paused. One breath. Tell them Captain sent help. Tell them Nightingale 6 called it in. The voice on the other end went very still. Confirm call sign. Say again, last transmission. Nightingale 6. She spoke the words like a prayer, like treason, like breathing for the first time in 3 months. Out. She hung up and stepped back into the hallway. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart wasn't racing. She'd just shattered the careful architecture of her civilian identity and replaced it with the truth, and in that moment, walking back to the patient station, she felt lighter than she had in months. The silence of the pre-dawn corridor wrapped around her like a familiar coat. That was when she noticed Dr. Mercer standing by Captain Chen's abandoned bed, a written chart in his hands, reviewing her notes with the kind of smile that promised consequences. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes were sharp with something she couldn't name. Not yet. Dr. Mercer's eyes were flat. Clinical. The kind of stare that belonged to a predator who'd already measured the distance to the kill. Katie held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to acknowledge the threat, not long enough to show fear, then turned back to her patient. The ranger's breathing had changed. The slight asymmetry in his chest rise, the almost imperceptible lag on the left side, the sound beneath the oxygen mask, she heard it before any monitor announced it. Tension pneumothorax. Recollapsed lung. The kind of complication that killed patients between one breath and the next. She was already moving, calling for the needle decompression kit, her voice steady as a surgical laser cutting through the chaos of the morning shift. I need a 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Now. Not a request. A command. The kind of command that made residents jump without questioning. A phlebotomist was at the supply cabinet before Katie finished speaking. The attending resident froze, his eyes darting between her and the monitors, but he didn't move to take over. He couldn't. His hands would shake. Hers wouldn't. Katie's fingers found the landmarks on the ranger's chest with the certainty of muscle memory, hands that had done this exact procedure in a Kandahar surgical tent with mortar rounds walking closer every 30 seconds. One point where the second rib met the collarbone. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from the pleural space. O2 sat climbing. 85. 88. 92. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. The ranger's breath deepened. He was going to live. And that's when she saw Dr. Mercer's phone come out of his pocket. He wasn't calling for a consult. He wasn't documenting anything. His fingers moved with the deliberation of someone calling in a favor, and Katie knew, the way she knew things without evidence, the way her body understood threats before her mind could articulate them, that whatever he was about to do, it was designed to ensure she never completed another shift. Her 14-year-old son had found her at 1800 hours, home 5 hours early, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands finally beginning to shake, a termination letter placed exactly in the center of the wood grain-like evidence at a crime scene. The letter was printed on Seattle General letterhead, dated 0620 hours, signed by Dr. Mercer and witnessed by 3 names she'd never met. Terminated for cause. Unauthorized contact with military authorities. Misrepresenting qualifications on employment application. She hadn't even called the army until after the ranger's lung recollapsed. After she'd already saved his life a second time. After she'd broken 3 different protocols because there was no protocol for discovering that the person on your operating table might be the one soldier you'd trained beside in the mountains outside Kandahar, the one whose call sign you'd whispered into a secure radio frequency 3 hours ago when she'd realized Captain James Chen needed help and the only people who could help him were the ones who understood why his chart said John Doe instead of his real name. Mom, what happened? Her son sat across from her, still wearing his school backpack, his face crumpling when she didn't answer. When she couldn't answer. When there were no words that weren't classified, no explanation that didn't require revealing the sealed records, the erased identity, the rank that officially never existed on any federal database, Captain Katie Rodriguez, call sign Nightingale 6, retired from a career that the Army had spent 3 years pretending never happened. She'd taken one measured breath at the moment security escorted her from the unit. One breath. Then she'd removed her badge, the new one, the civilian one, the one that said RN after her name instead of anything that mattered, and placed it on the nursing station desk with steady hands while Dr. Mercer stood 12 feet away, watching. Watching to confirm she was broken. Watching to ensure she stayed erased. The thing about erasure is that it's only effective if the person stays hidden. At 0920 hours the next morning, her son appeared in Seattle General's main lobby with his backpack bouncing against his spine and her shadow box clutched in both hands like a weapon. The thing she'd buried in the basement 3 years ago. The thing that held the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the combat medical badge, and the single photograph that proved the Army hadn't managed to scrub her completely from existence, a younger version of Katie in full combat uniform, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter with 37 members of the 75th Ranger Regiment behind her, their faces tan and lean and alive. "Mom, they need to see these," her son had said, breathless and crying and moving through the hospital like a kid who'd figured out his mother's entire life in one night. He'd found the box. Found the photograph. Found the medals mounted exactly where she'd hidden them, and understood somehow that hiding them had been the wrong strategy all along. Dr. Mercer was at the front desk filing his final paperwork, the documentation of her termination, the certified proof that he'd successfully destroyed her cover identity, when her son ran past him toward the ICU where Katie stood in civilian clothes, barred from entering by security guards who didn't recognize her. The ranger had regained consciousness 30 minutes earlier. His first coherent question had been about the nurse with the hand steady enough to reach into his chest and save his life twice. When he saw Katie's face through the glass partition, his eyes cleared completely. The kind of clarity that comes from recognizing someone you'd trained with under fire. His voice was rough, spent, but unmistakable, Nightingale 6. The name carried through the ICU wing like a radio frequency cutting through static. An older Marine visiting another patient turned at the sound. He had the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years understanding military call signs and what they meant. His eyes tracked from the ranger to Katie to the boy holding the shadow box, and something crystallized in his expression. He stepped forward without hesitation, lifted the citation card mounted beside the Purple Heart with hands that trembled slightly, and read aloud, for Vela under direct fire, Captain Katie Rodriguez, call sign Nightingale 6, extracted for wounded soldiers while maintaining under fire casualty care in hostile territory. Awarded by order of the Secretary of the Army. His voice cracked on the final words. A 2-star general arrived for the Rangers' transfer coordination and stopped mid-stride in the hallway. He was a man who understood insignia. Who understood what a Bronze Star actually meant, what a Purple Heart represented, what the single photograph of a woman in combat uniform carried when it was paired with that specific citation. He saluted the shadow box. Actually saluted, his hand trembling at his temple, the kind of respect that only comes when you realize you've been standing near someone you should have known better than to question. Dr. Mercer was still holding his pen when the Pentagon liaison stepped out of the elevator with a folder marked classified across its cover. The liaison was a woman with the kind of neutral expression that comes from delivering devastating news for a living, and she looked directly at Dr. Mercer when she spoke. Captain Rodriguez operated under codename Nightingale during classified operations. Her records were sealed by executive order. She glanced at her tablet, and Katie watched the moment Dr. Mercer understood he was finished. Which you attempted to access illegally at 0600 this morning when you submitted that query to the State Licensing Board. The request triggered a national security flag. The Pentagon has been looking for Captain Rodriguez for 3 years. And now we've found her. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming through the ceiling tiles. Katie's son was holding the medals higher, his arms shaking with the effort, with the relief of finally being allowed to acknowledge what his mother actually was. The combat medic who'd watched her work from the doorway the night before was staring openly, understanding now why her hands had moved with such precision, why the ranger had whispered her call sign like it was sacred. The general maintained his salute. Maintained it like she was still in uniform, still in the fight, still the person the army had sent into the mountains with nothing but a medical kit and the understanding that some of her team might not come back. Dr. Mercer's face drained of all color. Not anger. Not frustration. Something worse. Understanding. The realization that he'd spent 3 weeks attempting to destroy someone whose cover had been protected by federal order, whose career had been classified at levels he didn't have clearance to even imagine. The man had no idea who he'd been standing next to in the supply room, accusing of incompetence while she'd been one of the most highly decorated combat medics the Army had ever produced. Katie reached for the shadow box and her son released it immediately, his hands falling to his sides, tears streaming freely now because he finally didn't have to pretend his mother was just a nurse anymore. She didn't look at Dr. Mercer. Didn't need to. The liaison was already speaking into her radio, and within minutes, FBI agents would arrive. Within hours, the insurance fraud investigation that had been gathering evidence for 8 months would suddenly have Dr. Mercer's fabricated documentation, his falsified credentials to the licensing board, his attempt to access sealed military records, all of it matching the pattern of criminal conspiracy they'd been waiting to prove. But that wasn't the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered was when Katie stood in that hallway, holding the medals her son had risked everything to reveal, and finally allowed herself to be seen. The lobby doors burst open at 0920 hours. Katie's 14-year-old son sprinted across the polished floor, backpack bouncing, his voice cutting through the morning quiet like an alarm. "Mom, they need to see these." His breathing came in gulps, not from fear, but from running, from the weight of what he carried. Katie turned from the medication cart, her jaw tightening the way it always did when something shifted. When something became real. She didn't move toward him. Captain's composure. Wait. Listen. Then act. Her son skidded to a stop beside the nursing station, chest heaving, and pulled open his backpack with trembling fingers, not the trembling of weakness, but the trembling of 18-year-old hands holding history. He withdrew the shadow box. 8 by 10 inches. Black velvet backing. Burnished metal catches. Inside, arranged with military precision, lay everything the Army had spent 3 years trying to erase: a bronze star on its ribbon, the medal catching the fluorescent light like a tiny sun. A purple heart beside it, the George Washington profile facing forward. A combat medical badge stamped with crossed caduceus and rifle. And in the corner, the single photograph that had survived the scrubbing: Katie in desert fatigues, Kandahar in 2021, her face younger but her eyes already carrying the weight of knowing too much. The hallway went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that happens when people stop breathing without meaning to. That's... Her son started, his voice cracking with the specific emotion of a child finally understanding what his mother had been carrying all along. Mom, the guy, your patient, he's awake. And he's asking for you. Katie moved through the hallway with the steady precision of muscle memory taking over. Her shoes clicked on the linoleum, a sound like a metronome, 1 2, 1 2, and nurses parted without her asking them to. The shadow box remained visible in her son's hands, impossible to look away from, impossible to unsee. This was the moment the nurse uniform became inadequate. This was the moment the cover story fractured. She found Captain James Cheng conscious, propped on 3 pillows, his chest wrapped tight beneath the hospital gown. His left side was still wrapped, the needle decompression wound from yesterday already crusting over with the strange efficiency of bodies trained to heal themselves. His eyes locked on hers the instant she entered the room. And his voice came out barely above a whisper, rough from intubation, but clear as reconnaissance intel, Nightingale 6. Not a question. Recognition. The call sign floated between them like a physical object, like the oxygen the machines were pushing into his lungs. Katie's breath caught, but her face remained level. Years of medical training made that possible. Years of ops made it necessary. She took his wrist, checking his radial pulse with 2 fingers, strong, steady, 78 beats per minute. The vitals of a man already returning to baseline. "You're awake," she said. 10 words exactly. No inflection. "You saved my life." Chen's eyes moved past her, toward the doorway where nurses were starting to gather. Twice. An older Marine appeared in the doorway, a visitor, maybe 70, with silver hair and the particular posture that comes from 40 years of dress uniforms. He was holding a piece of paper, laminated, worn, clearly carried everywhere for years. His eyes landed on the shadow box in Katie's son's hands, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition of a different kind. He stepped forward, his voice trembling in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Bronze star." He paused, composing himself. "Purple heart." Another pause, longer. His eyes skimmed the citation on the laminated paper, his jaw working. Then he read aloud, his voice cracking like old leather. "Under direct fire, Captain Rodriguez extracted for wounded while maintaining suppressive cover and coordinated medevac with hostile forces within 200 meters. By her actions, 4 soldiers returned to their families. By her valor, 1 nation remained secure." The Marines don't cry. But they stand very still sometimes, and this one stood very still, the paper shaking slightly in his hands. A commotion in the hallway. Footsteps that carried authority, not the quick step of hospital staff, but the measured pace of someone accustomed to people moving out of their way. A 2-star general entered the room in dress uniform, his ribbons arranged in perfect order, his bearing the kind that makes the air pressure change. His eyes found the shadow box immediately. He stopped mid-stride. His right hand rose slowly, deliberately, and he saluted, not a casual gesture, but a full ceremonial salute, directly to the medals in her son's trembling hands. The kind of salute given to heroes. The kind of salute that tells a story about who gets to be seen. Behind the general, a man in a pressed suit appeared, holding a folder marked classified in letters that seemed to glow under the hospital lighting. Pentagon, Katie registered. She knew the look, the particular combination of bureaucratic certainty and classified authority that came from people who moved between worlds civilians couldn't access. The Pentagon liaison stepped forward and his voice filled the room like a command. Captain Rodriguez operated under code name Nightingale. Her records were sealed by executive order, which you attempted to access illegally at 0600 this morning, Dr. Mercer. The words found their target like a precision strike. He wasn't reading. He was declaring. Your attempts to access military databases and forge documentation regarding Captain Rodriguez's credentials created a digital trail that exposed additional forgeries, phantom procedures coded on Medicare patients, kickback arrangements with a medical supply company that delivered 50% of the quantities invoiced, billing codes altered on 63 patient charts. Mercer hadn't entered the room yet. Katie heard him in the hallway, a door closing, feet shuffling backward, the sound of a man losing his footing on solid ground. FBI agents appeared within 55 minutes, their credentials flashing like lightning in the administrative office where Mercer had barricaded himself, claiming administrative privilege. They moved with the casual efficiency of people who had done this before. The insurance fraud investigation, the one running for 8 months, the one Mercer had never known existed, suddenly had new evidence. Katie's meticulous charting, the notes he'd tried to discredit, had catalogued every discrepancy perfectly. The phantom procedures. The kickbacks. The falsified schedules designed to isolate her. The illegal access attempts to her sealed records. It was all there, documented with the precision of someone trained to notice everything, trained to survive by knowing exactly what she was seeing. They placed him in handcuffs in the main lobby during morning rounds. Every nurse he'd once commanded watched from the corridor, the ones who'd gathered their lunches and left when Katie sat down, the ones who'd pretended to be busy when he walked past. The ones who'd whispered about her incompetence. They watched him pass in handcuffs, his jaw clenched, his eyes facing forward but his career tilting backward into darkness. The board that had displayed her fabricated write-up now showed something different, a reinstatement notice. Captain Katie Rodriguez, U.S. Army, Combat Medical Badge, authorized for full duty. Her name restored. Her rank visible. Her identity claimed. In the cardiac care unit, the combat medic who'd recognized her technique in the needle decompression asked for her autograph on his training manual, the one he used to teach combat medicine to the next generation. His hand shook slightly as he handed her the pen. Katie signed it once, cleanly, Captain Katie Rodriguez, with the date. No flourish. No explanation. Just a name returned to the light. Captain Chen gripped her hand before they loaded him for transfer to Walter Reed. His recovery was tracking ahead of schedule, the efficiency of a warrior's body, the kind that heals because stopping isn't an option. You saved my life twice, Nightingale, he whispered. I'll never forget. Katie's son stood beside her in that moment, the shadow box finally closed, no longer hidden, finally understood. His eyes had changed too, not with fear, but with the specific kind of clarity that comes when you realize your mother's silences weren't weakness. They were restraint. They were protection. They were the tactical composure of someone who'd learned to carry her own weight, and then other people's weight, and then entire operations' worth of weight, without ever asking anyone to help her stand. 6 months later, Katie stood in Seattle General's rehabilitation wing wearing her dress uniform. The captain's insignia was visible now, centered over her chest, no longer hidden beneath scrub jackets and careful silence. Through the window, Denver sunset painted the mountains copper and gold, the light catching the peaks like a final salute. Her son stood beside her, taller now, wearing a ROTC recruitment shirt, his posture already shifting toward the military bearing she'd never explicitly taught him but somehow always modeled. Captain Chen joined them on crutches, his recovery continuing exactly as she'd predicted, his gratitude present in every way except words, in how he stood at attention, in how his eyes never left her, in how he'd requested transfer back to Seattle General for his final weeks of rehabilitation. Someone had seen Dr. Mercer last week, they said. driving a medical supply van for the same company that had paid him kickbacks, wearing an orange safety vest over civilian clothes, delivering to the service entrance he'd once swept through like royalty. His medical license permanently revoked. His fraud conviction keeping him from ever practicing again. His career ended not by Katie's hand, but by his own. By evidence. By truth. Katie didn't smile at the news. Didn't feel the weight lift. It had already lifted the moment she stopped hiding. She simply placed her hand on her son's shoulder, watching the light fade, and said quietly, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The hallway behind them bustled with evening shift, a new nurse struggling with a difficult for placement on an elderly patient, frustration creeping into her movements. Katie turned without being asked and moved to help, her hand steady, her voice kind, her movements sure. That's where the real work was. Not in the medals. Not in the recognition. Not in the salutes and the Pentagon briefings. In this moment. In this patient. In the quiet act of helping someone else carry their weight. This was the work that had always defined her, finally done in the light. This was what Nightingale 6 had always been, not a call sign for combat, but a name for service. For saving. For seeing the people others missed. You've just watched someone come home. And I want to know, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Share your story in the comments. Like this video if you've ever felt invisible despite doing everything right. Subscribe for more stories about hidden heroes, because they're everywhere, and they deserve to be seen. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together.